Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Robert Bobi Wine ebintu azzeemu okubyonoona. Agamba nti Amerika esusse okuwa Museveni ensimbi empitirivu stop funding Mwai Museveni. Agamba buli mwaka Amerika ewa Museveni oba ne gavumenti ye ensimbi eziri eyo mu buwumbi n'obuwumbi bwa $, nga zino za bya maje oba kuyamba ku maje ga Uganda mbu ate Mwai Museveni ensimbi zino zakozesa obubi. Kati agamba stop funding Museveni. Awanise ebigere alumye n'ogwengulu. Agamba tagenda kussa mukono, tagenda kuweera paka ng'eggwanga la Amerika erisinga okuwa Mwai Museveni ensimbi empitirivu mu by'ekinnamagye alirekeddaawo okuwa Mwai Museveni ensimbi. Bobi Wine alemerako akkaatiriza nti ensimbi zino Mwai Museveni bwe zimuweebwa tazikozesa ebyo bye zirina kukola wabula azikozesa okunyigiriza bannayuganda ate bannannyini nsi era balina okukulembera obukulembeze obulungi n'okubakulaakulanya ate ensimbi azikozesa kubakolako bikolobero. Agamba kyamutwaziza omusango mu kkooti y'ensi yonna era ogwakkiriziddwa ye musanyufu akimanyi olunaku lugenda ku kyalumu Mwai Museveni bamukabe jeke. Bigambo bye agamba nti Afrika egaanye okukulaakulana lwa bannabyabufuzi oba lwa bakulembeze ba president abalinga Mwai Museveni mbu abeerowoozaako bokka nga tebalowooza ku bantu bebakulembera. Bigambo bya Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Robert Bobi Wine. Munyiivu bitya agamba ye agenda kufiirawo, agenda kuluma n'ogwengulu, agenda kusimba Nakakongo paka Mwai Museveni ng'amugye mu ntebe. Alayidde n'akomba ne ku paasi, n'akomba kwerima, n'agamba ye tagenda kussa mukono, tagenda kuweera okujjako nga Mwai Museveni avuddemu eyo entebe. Agamba ye alemerako nti bannayuganda mu 2021 akalulu akaakubwa gwe baasalawo nga pulezidenti waabwe era gwe baalonda nti Mwai Museveni ya hijackinga bu hijackinzi n'atuula mu ntebe ne yeelayiza ng'akozesa amagye ga Uganda. Mbu amaanyi ag'amagye ge galina emmundu ze bakozesa tanka ebyambalo byonna ebyo bigulwa ensimbi mu Amerika zaawa Mwai Museveni. Kati alemeddeko agamba yotava mu Amerika nga Amerika tesazizzaamu buyambi bwa Museveni buli kadde kubanga buyambi bubwewa Mwai Museveni ate Mwai Museveni bwakozesa okutyoboola eddembe ly'obuntu human rights violation mu ggwanga lya Uganda. Ebigambo nno si byangu eri Kyagulanyi alabika akalambidde omusajja ali serious. Agamba yakooye okulaba nga bannayuganda babonaabona, akooye okulaba bannayuganda nga baavu ng'amalwaliro temuli ddagala, nga byenjigiriza bifunnyo fufululudda ate nga emmese ziruma n'okuluma abaana mu malwaliro ga gavumenti ne bafa n'abaana abazaaliddwa nabo bakutuka basibwa ku seminti malwaliro ga gavumenti agasinga obungi. Kati nga ye yasalawo nti okukulemberamu bannayuganda obalaga ekituufu tayinza kukkiriza nga bino bigenda mu maaso kyokka ng'ate Amerika esindika obutitimbe n'obutitimbe bw'ensimbi mu ggwanga lya Uganda wabula Mwai Museveni mbonaazikozesa bubi ne famire ye. Kati nkusaba otwegatteko tufune Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Robert Bobi Wine okuva ali mu ggwanga lya Amerika gy'ali ng'asimbye Nakakongo alemeddeko akambye ne ku paasi. Agamba ye tagenda kuweera, tagenda kussa mukka okujjako nga Amerika ekomeza okuwa Mwai Museveni ensimbi zeemuwa era mbw ayagala Mwai Museveni abeere yala olwo Kyagulanyi kimwanguyire okusindika gavumenti ya Mwai Museveni egweri ekigwo nga talina wadde esimooni. Agamba bino baabikola ne ku Idi Amin Dada era Idi Amin Dada bwe yabulwa ensimbi eziyimirizawo gavumenti yamaliriza nga gavumenti ye egudde n'adduka mbuyinza. Kati n'ekyo naye kyali mu kufuba okulaba ng'atema Mwai Museveni emirandira gyonna gy'ajja ensimbi asigale nga yala gavumenti emulemerere ajja kumaliriza ng'akunyizzaamu kakukola tondeka nnyuma. Kale katufune Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Robert Bobi Wine.
We want $1 billion for 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So over the years, there was an improvement because there was an alignment of both demand side effectors and supply side factors, which oftentimes is not the case. So I would urge aid coordination, particularly in poorer countries, particularly in fragile countries, particularly in more vulnerable countries like Zimbabwe, like Malawi, like Mozambique, like Zambia, where capacity is constrained, and because of your lack of capacity, you don't look a gift horse in the mouth, and you just accept anything, bamba zonge, to use a local language, for just accepting anything without scrutiny. without oversight. The second thing that I want to mention.
Yeah, Tender, just if you could wrap up and then I'll let Bobby come in.
Okay, I'll wrap up by saying that the second thing that is very critical with aid as well is the capacity of the state to absorb that. You go to town about this book. So a couple of years ago, we got Zimbabwe got SDRs, special drawing rights, of about $500 million from the IMF. I took around $200 million of that and I put it in infrastructure. We hardly could spend $70 million of that because of lack of capacity. So state effectiveness is very critical in terms of aid exception. Lastly, I want to make the point, Greg and Bob, that the book on aid is a continuation of the conversation which we started in Making Africa Work and in Democracy Work. There are certain things that are fundamental to the effectiveness of aid. Number one, the existence of democracy, the existence of leaders that are accountable and can be held to account by their citizens. Number two, the effectiveness of institutions. Institutions must be strong, institutions must be functional. Number three, the question of leadership. Leadership is so important, but effective leadership has to be legitimate. So you have a problem in Uganda because Yoweri Museveni is not legitimate. You have a problem in Zimbabwe because Emerson Dambudzo Mnangagwa is not legitimate. You will not have that problem in Zambia because HH is legitimate. So not just a question of effective, strong leadership, you see in Rwanda, but also the legitimacy of that leader. Number four is the voice of the people. How effective is civic society? How effective are the trade unions, business organizations? Because that too is a quality on the aid that we receive. Lastly, how effective is this state? How well managed is it? Because aid is ephemeral and aid is not consistent. So we must use aid as a means of building an effective state that makes aid oblivious, that makes aid administered. And these are things that we've discussed both in Making Africa Work and in Democracy Works. I will stop here, my friend.
Thanks very much, Tender. We'll pick up on some of these issues shortly. Your key point right in the middle of that was that, you know, aid is about politics. It's not a technocratic exercise. You've got to get the politics right. You can't just simply arrive with a lot of technical assistance and expect that you're going to transform a developmental environment. To go back to the question then, Bobby, which I hope we've resolved our technical issue. What do you think?
I really hope so. Please confirm.
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. What do you think donors should be?
Thank you very much.
Confirming. What should donors be doing to support rights and local ownership in countries?
Thank you very much, first of all, for having me. I am very honored to be part of this conversation and part of this webinar. I want to, first of all, congratulate you, Dr. Greg Mills, for the accomplishment on that work, and to thank you for always writing, not only for leisure, not only for entertainment, but for good consumption and for development. It is hard in humanity to realize how important one's work is, but I want you to know that your work is very important. And I'm very honored to also feature somewhere on that amazing work. Looking at my name on the front page of that book, it's really humbling for me. Like I've said severally, what I bring on the table in the world discussion and in world, but particularly African politics, is a view of very many people, largely young people, but again, also those excluded from the conversation, the ghetto people, the less privileged, the young men and women that are unemployed, those who happen to be the majority, not just in my country, Uganda, but the world. And I'm very glad that largely by my thoughts, which are not necessarily professional, but popular, I'm glad that these thoughts are represented in many important conversations like this very one. And also my brother Tendai, I send you salutations. I'm sure you will relate a great deal from what and Zimbabwe. We share the plight, we share the challenges of authoritarianism, of lawlessness, of disrespect to democracy. But again, we share aspirations as well. Now, we know that if Zambia did it, then we shall also did it. So I send you salutations. These are my thoughts on aid. First of all, and I'm glad, Greg, you mentioned it, that aid has been politicized. It's with the politics, not necessarily what it is proclaimed to be purposeful of. Otherwise, we wouldn't, the development partners wouldn't continue pouring aid where they know that it is not only ineffective or unhelpful, but detrimental to the people that they purport to be sending it to. In the context of Uganda, where I come from, we receive a very substantial, foreign aid portion. Our budget is largely funded by foreign aid. We are the second largest receivers of military aid from the United States in sub-Saharan Africa. We, continue to receive aid, but this aid comes from democracies, which democracies had to be strict and had to stand by their principles to ensure that they achieve the standard of life and therefore the standard of carrying themselves that they are on, but they continue to fund not the moral, political and social development, but this moral, social, and most importantly, political decay. And I'm very glad Comrade Tendai has mentioned it. I always give Uganda or Zimbabwe as live examples, because the world can no longer pretend not to see what is happening in Zimbabwe since the days of Robert Mugabe. So when they deal with Zimbabwe, they are actually being partners in crime. The world cannot continue to pretend they don't see what is happening in Uganda. Maybe the oppressions, maybe the abuse of rights and the undermining of democracy in other countries is not as pronounced as it is in Uganda. But the world watched when the internet was shut off in Uganda, when General Museveni ordered blatantly for an on-street massacre, and young men and women and children were murdered, which I believe if it happened anywhere, no country, anywhere in Europe or in a developed country, they would want to relate with. Unfortunately, even when these development partners, the United States, the European Union, issued statements showing that indeed this is an illegitimate regime, they continue to pour money to extend foreign aid to Uganda. And that brings it to us that it is indeed being political, but not moral, not for what it's required, but of the people that are receiving the aid, but what is required.
Bobi abadde tukyali ne Kyagulanyi Center. Internet erabika emukuttemu.
Tendai, can you see Bobby?
I can see him, but he's frozen. So I think it's probably the network issue in Kampala.
Maybe rather like I'll attempt to record a song.
They may have switched off the internet. They may have switched off the internet. Yeah.
Right, well, let me come back to you then, Tendai. Where in your experience when you were Minister of Finance in Zimbabwe was aid money well spent?
I think that aid does very where the state has hit rock bottom and retreated. So when I got into government in 2009, there was total collapse. Hospitals were shut, clinics were shut, schools had been closed. Teachers had stopped going to school in July of 2007. So under that circumstance, the absorption capacity is very high because you are starting from very low. So we got a huge grant from the Global Fund, Geneva, that we used to pay for doctors, to pay for nurses, to provide for drugs. And of course, we put in money as our budget improved. We put money, I called it the especially vulnerable targeted areas. So we put in 2 million. I would save $2 million US, and I would put it in an institution. I started off with the Harare Hospital and then the Mupilo Hospital. I saw images of Harare hospitals on CNN. Kebule Mabusa, a South African journalist. I think Bob is back, and I couldn't believe it was Zimbabwe. So education and health, there was huge absorption. So those areas, aid tends to be effective, particularly when you hit bottom. I think he's back.
Bobby, I don't know whether you're having the same network issues as we had when we tried to record the song, but just as a way of introduction, when Bobby and I met as a studio, one of his security guards was asked by a whole range of intelligence operatives that sit opposite his headquarters who I was, and one of them jokingly said, which unfortunately turned out to be rather disastrous in terms of trying to record the songs, that was
tukyali ne Kyagulanyi Sentamu Robert Bobi Wine nga lina bakulembeze abamu ob'enjawulo okuva mu nsi yonna aboogera ku nsonga z'ensimbi eziweebwa Africa okuva mu Africa zeewa Africa nti zigasa ki, zirina omugaso oba tezirina. Abakulembeze ba Africa bazikozesa nga zirina okukozesebwa oba bazikozesa byabwe kwekumira mu buyinza naye ate nga si kuyamba banna be balina okuyamba okulanga ensi zaabwe zikulaakulana. Gwe mulamu oguliwo oguli mu kwogerwako. Bobi Wine afunyemuko ku buzibu internet n'esukka neevaako naye nga omulamwa gugenda kutandika bulungi, abyogereko bulungi era ensonga zituuke bulungi ku nsimbi eziva mu ggwanga lya America n'eziwa Africa. Abakulembeze abaziweebwa bazikozesa nga bwe zinokolebwa
the internet. They may have switched off the internet. Yeah.
Right, well, let me come back to you then, Tendai. Where in your experience when you were Minister of Finance in Zimbabwe was aid money well spent?
I think that aid does very well where the state has hit rock bottom and retreated. So when I got into government in 2009, there was total collapse. Hospitals were shut, clinics were shut, schools had been closed. Teachers had stopped going to school in July of 2007. So under that circumstance, the absorption capacity is very high because you are starting from very low. So we got a huge grant from the Global Fund, Geneva, that we used to pay for doctors, to pay for nurses, to provide for drugs. And of course, we put in money as our budget improved. We put money, I called it the especially vulnerable targeted areas. So we put in 2 million, I would save $2 million US, and I would put it in an institution. I started off with the Harare Hospital and then the Mupilo Hospital. I saw images of Harare hospitals on CNN. Kebule Mabusa, a South African journalist. I think Bob is back, and I couldn't believe it was Zimbabwe. So education and health, there was huge absorption. So those areas, aid tends to be effective, particularly when you visit photo. I think he's back.
Bobby, I don't know whether you're having the same network issues as we had when we tried to record the song, but just as a way of introduction, when Bobby and I met as a studio, one of his security guards was asked by a whole range of intelligence operatives that sit opposite his headquarters who I was, and one of them jokingly said, which unfortunately turned out to be rather disastrous in terms of trying to record the song, that was Justin Bieber coming to record a song with Bobby Wine. I have to say my kids all rolled their eyes virtually round in their head. But the net result of it was they turned the power off to the studio, and we had to spend half of our day going across different places. Wherever Bobby went, they turned the power off. Just a small, rather benign illustration of the difficulties of being an opposition figure in Uganda. Bobby, back to you.
Thank you very much, Greg. Apologies for the network glitch. It has become a norm for the internet to constantly be disrupted, as I'm always surrounded and I have operatives wherever. But I'll keep trying to maneuver so I keep connected. Please bear with me if I happen to keep being on and off. That is how it is here in Uganda. So I was still continuing my submission, or rather rant, about aid and how instead of being helpful is being detrimental. There is a tendency of not putting conditions, moral conditions that I believe are conscriptive of all of us as humanity, but most importantly, as the international community, for values like democracy, like respect for human rights, like respect for the rule of law, things that bring us together. And it has been a constant call, not just for us here in Uganda, but all over Africa, in countries that are ruled by authoritarian rulers, to make the respect of human rights and rule of law and preservation of democracy as preconditions for aid. But here is a situation, like I was giving a live example before I went off, that the COVID pandemic has had Uganda receive a lot of foreign aid. Of course, to help with the health care system, because we are battling a disease. Unfortunately, not a single new healthcare has been built. As a matter of fact, medical hospitals medical schools continue to be closed, while military and police schools are open. Thereby, international foreign aid being a helper and a facilitator for the tyrants, particularly here in Uganda, and also to the detriment of the people. Rights are being abused, sponsored by the donor funds. Citizens are being massacred, sponsored by donor funds, and the military and security agencies that are carrying out those atrocities are instead being helped and funded more. That explains why there was recently a protest by Ugandans trying to call upon the IMF not to just continue pouring aid, especially to an illegitimate regime in Uganda, a regime that was clearly pronounced, albeit technically, by the international community, that it is illegitimate. And that's why, as I close, we feel very represented by your book, Dr. Greg Mills, Expensive Poverty. Our poverty is expensive because our poverty actually costs us. The money that is borrowed in our names, which is going to be paid by our children and our children's children, is actually being used to keep us poorer, to oppress us, to take away even the rights. Now they're taking away the resources, and the resources are helping them to come back again and take away the rights. So it is expensive 360. I thank you very much.
It's also expensive, Bobby, because thank you very much. It's also expensive because you spend an awful lot of money and don't have much in the way of results in terms of income. outcomes to show for it. Would you agree, before coming back to Tendai, that donors should calibrate their aid to spend more money on areas of success in democratic terms? I once, and this is in the book, had an argument with an American colonel in Bagram Air Force Base in Afghanistan when he was talking about spending money in the most insecure areas. I said, spend the money in the areas that are successful and reinforce success. Do you think that aid has done the wrong thing by trying to remedy failure when it should have been trying to reinforce success? In other words, making those countries, in this instance, more democratic, better functioning, giving them the reward, because we know that that is the substance of more complete and better functioning regimes. Would you agree that calibrating aid in a way that reinforced the success of democracy was a good way to go overall for donors?
That aid should be used to reinforce success, and where there is not been success, especially in terms of democracy and human rights, then there shouldn't be constantly money poured there reinforcing success. I'll still ask a question: is there interest to reinforce the success? Is there interest? Is the international community, is the donor community really looking at enforcing democracy, or it is rather to have the authoritarian rulers work to their interests, which I would not also disagree with, but which interests are at least not to the detriment of the rights and freedoms of the people that are purported to receive the donor aid. I will also be quick to add, Greg, that there is a misunderstanding, and a grave one, that the aid is helpful to the people. Looking in the context of Uganda, you will realize that after a long research, it has been discovered that those that are every authoritarian regime builds a network of what the government officials here in Uganda love to call the mafia, which budgets for the donor money even before the donor money comes into the country. And as soon as the donor money gets in the country, it is already shared. I'll give an example of a current minister of security, Jim Muhwezi, who was indicted and indeed imprisoned for embezzling global fund money and the money that was used meant to help the victims of HIV/AIDS. He was later released and deployed by General Museveni as a minister. The same goes to Jim Muhwezi was the then Minister for Health, who got billions swindled, and therefore hundreds of thousands of people died because there was no the money that was meant to help them was swindled. Same thing happened to another minister called Mike Mukula. Interestingly, all these ministers were just promoted. But not only that, look, for example, development funds that are brought in, and the regime, the highly placed people who are in office, ministers, permanent secretaries, name them, especially those that are connected to the regime. Interestingly, in General Museveni's family are pointed at to be the ones sharing the donor money to themselves. And like I said, there's a narrative that is put there, but there's a reality on ground. Thereby, agreeing with you further that aid, especially where it has worked, should be used to enforce successful areas. Thank you, Greg.
Thanks very much, Bobby. I'll come back to you before we close. Tenda, I wanted to ask you about, since you were a finance minister in a country that had gone through an exceptionally long and bad patch, how would you characterize the difference from your experience in the chair between Western aid and Chinese aid? It's meant very, very different things to very many people, and I have made the distinction in the book in many respects. I'm sitting in a country, Zambia, that's perhaps received some of the worst bits of Chinese aid, not very well scrutinized, lots of deals done on the side, with extremely opaque and very, very difficult to understand why those deals were made. And I guess part of the responsibility of this new government here is going to be unpicking some of them. But what was, from your experience, the big difference between traditional ODA and new sources of aid, including China? Tendai.
Well, thank you, Greg. I think it's a fundamental question. And I think this is one of my big point of departures with Dambisa Moyo's book, because she naively romanticizes Chinese aid and treats it as some kind of solution and El Dorado to fragile, vulnerable African states. My experience with China were very extractive, very extractive. I went to China. I went to China, and the government had huge debts that had been incurred before the government of national unity came into being. The government that I was a minister. So there was a lot of money that Zimbabwe owed to the Chinese. So one of the points, one of the submissions I made to the Chinese authorities, the Chinese Import and Export Bank, their Minister of Trade, incidentally in China, the African portfolio is handled not by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, by the Minister of Trade. So I made a case on oppressive interest rates on the US dollar that were in excess of 20-25%. And I argued, and I had graphs comparing the interest that they were charging on huge American indebtedness to China, which actually was in excess of $2 trillion. They were charging something like 0.75%, less than 1% on interest, and we were paying 18%, 22%. So I made the argument in a very nationalistic manner that, oh, you're our comrades, you're all our all-weather friends. And they actually, stopped speaking English and reverted to speaking in Mandarin. And I realized that I was making no sense. So that was number one. Then number two, the nature of the projects, how expensive the money was. I'll give you one example. On Kariba, the Zambians put two generators on Kariba North, and Zimbabwe put two generators on Kariba South. The purpose of these generators is to ensure that even if the water table in Kariba goes low, those tables ensure that supply is guaranteed. In the case of Zimbabwe, 700 megawatts of energy. The Zambians paid around $200 million for their two generators. Zimbabwe paid around $500 million about double what the Zambians had made. So I found a lot of extraction, a lot of corruption in Chinese deals, and very expensive. The last thing that I want to mention about Chinese aid is that oftentimes the quality of the product leaves a lot to be desired. Whether it's a road, whether it's a bridge, the quality of the product is very terrible. In Zimbabwe, we have a term for it. We call it Xinjiang. So Xinjiang is a low-quality Chinese product, whether it's a road, whether it's a suit, whether it's a textile, whether it's a power station. Zimbabweans characterize it as Xinjiang because the quality is very low. So extraction, corruption, low quality, and high expensive, very expensive. So the kind of things that they've done, certainly in Zimbabwe. Right now, they're busy, extracting minerals in graveyards and national parks and so forth. The kind of things that the Chinese are doing, certainly from my own personal experience, if they were to be done by the United States of America, by Canada, by the United Kingdom, the left will be up in arms to describe those things as some form of neocolonialism, which is unacceptable. So my experience has been very sad and very unhappy, if I might say so myself.
Well, one of the things the book looks at in some detail, because I was challenged on this on earlier drafts, was trying to come up with a funding model that would assist Africa meet its huge infrastructure backlog that would not be subject to high levels of corruption. And in the book, I reveal several instances of corruption on major infrastructure projects, which are not in the public eye as of yet, but they're being exposed in this book. Of course, it's a challenge to try and work out what that system is. Generally speaking, a better system is when the people who build the infrastructure pay for it and operate it, because in a sense, they're not going to overcharge themselves in order to be able to get the money back. And their own revenue model is obviously going to have to be competitive in the delivery of whatever services they're providing, whether it be transportation or particularly in the area of power. So rather than have an outsider contract and where all the gouging occurs between politicians and contractors, is get them to not only build but also to operate as a way of keeping the costs reasonable. Bobby, one of the things, and I know we're drawing into our last few minutes, one of the things the book looks at, and this is in part because between books, I've spent a lot of time talking to the likes of Cardinal Peter Turkson and Bishop Precious Amuku and others who have a wider view about development and a wider view of the needs of our societies and a longer view. There's a section in the book that speaks of a moral economy and the importance of creating a moral economy, to seeing economies not just in terms of extraction, not just in terms of dollars and cents and of growth figures, but seeing them in terms of a long-term equilibrium between taking and giving. What do you understand by the term a moral economy, and do you see such a moral economy as being crucial both for donors and in their long-term nature of what it is that they do, but also in terms of the way in which we conduct our lives within our own countries? You're muted again.
I'm sorry, can you hear me right now? Thank
Yes.
you very much. There's a verse in a song that I had the honor of being part of it, where it says, "No more charity, it's a collaboration." It should be a collaboration, not charity, not helping, because when the donors view it as help, as charity, then they're going to just throw any nonsense to the reception countries. They are just going to want to look at, they're not going to be held accountable. This is not charity, it's not free. We all know it's not free. It's a collaboration. And it is not only quid pro quo. It is not just the exchange of money and the raw materials. It should also be an exchange of respect, of dignity, of values, because you don't do business with people you don't share values with. The donor
Bobby unfortunately seems to have left the room again on the mention of the word "don't do charity, just do collaboration." I know that we've got a couple of minutes to go. Briefly, I'd firstly like to thank very much Tendai and Bobby for their participation in spite of all the technical challenges. To thank the Daily Maverick and
can I just make one point? Can I just make one point
Tendai,
before you close? Yeah, very, very quickly. I think we need to throw into the conversation, and the book does that, the comparison between the aid that we receive and the money we actually lose in leakages. So in the case of Zimbabwe, we get around $800 million in terms of overseas development assistance. But what goes out of Zimbabwe in terms of leakages, illicit financial flows and corruption is about $3 billion a year. So in other words, if Zimbabwe and many other African countries were actually to plug just their leakages, they actually don't need aid. But of course, you and I know that that will never happen. I thought that point needed to be into the conversation.
Bobby unfortunately seems to have left the room again on the mention of the word.
Thank you very much. There's a verse in a song that I had the honor of being part of it, where it says, "No more charity, it's a collaboration." It should be a collaboration, not charity, not helping, because when the donors view it as help, as charity, then they're going to just throw any nonsense to the reception countries. They are just going to want to look at, they're not going to be held accountable. This is not charity. It's not free. We all know it's not free. It's a collaboration. And it is not only quid pro quo. It is not just the exchange of money and the raw materials. It should also be an exchange of respect, of dignity, of values, because you don't do business with people you don't share values with. The donor
Bobby unfortunately seems to have left the room again on the mention of the word "don't do charity, just do collaboration." I know that we've got a couple of minutes to go. Briefly, I'd firstly like to thank very much Tendai and Bobby for their participation in spite of all the technical challenges. To thank the Daily Maverick and
can I just make one point? Can I just make one
Tendai,
point before you close? Yeah, very, very quickly. I think we need to throw into the conversation, and the book does that, the comparison between the aid that we receive and the money we actually lose in leakages. So in the case of Zimbabwe, we get around $800 million in terms of overseas development assistance. But what goes out of Zimbabwe in terms of leakages, illicit financial flows and corruption is about $3 billion a year. So in other words, if Zimbabwe and many other African countries were actually to plug just their leakages, they actually don't need aid. But of course, you and I know that that will never happen. I thought that point needed to be into the conversation.
Yeah. Just to thank the Maverick and then Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, And then it's a very difficult conversation to summarize a 450-page book in a very brief, an hour-long chat. The book is available, can be purchased from the Daily Maverick shop. I would just summarize it by saying, in addition to everything that Bobi and Tendai have said, is that, you know, things happen for a reason and things don't happen for good reasons as well. And often donors go into situations believing that it's a question of enlightenment, that if they simply go and enlighten somebody as to a better way to do things, that will happen that way. It takes very little into consideration about local circumstances, about local laws, traditions, customs, operating practices, and of course about local politics. So you need to understand why things happen, but also why they don't happen. Welcome back, Bobi. It's not just about the what. Most donors like to go in and say, this is what you should do. This is, it's not about that, it's about how people should do things. And it's fundamentally about local ownership. So for aid to be successful, it has to really be, and this is what the conclusion of the book goes into in some depth, it has to be a strategic undertaking. It has to take a long view. It has to be matched by the application of resources. It has to involve people at its center. It has to involve process in the form of institutions. And it has to, of course, involve leadership willing to make tough decisions about those priorities and where they put themselves relative to their people. This is not a book, let me end by saying, despite being in Zambia and at risk of heresy, this is not a book like Dambisa Moyo's that says it's all about the failure of aid. It's about aid answers some of those questions in the way in which it's been given. But to say that I give you money and therefore you're poor is clearly ridiculous. This is about how aid is used, about the manner in which it's used. And just as a business, you need money to grow and to develop, just as individuals need money to be invested in their education and their healthcare, countries need to borrow. They can borrow as cheaply as possible from grants. They can borrow very expensively from some other sources, but they need money to borrow. And the book focuses on not eliminating the system of aid. Quite to the contrary, it focuses very much on making the system of aid more perfect, of taking a longer term view, of getting the fundamentals right, and how we could learn from all the experiences that we have gathered over particularly the last 30 years in the post-Cold War environment about where aid is spent well and where it's been spent badly. And to throw light on those issues, I've been joined by two of the most fantastic individuals, courageous, if they mind me saying so, to an absolute fault, in Tendai Biti and Bobi Wine. And we look forward to taking this discussion forward in a whole range of different settings. Bobi, Tendai, thank you from the bottom of my heart, not just for today, but for the long-term commitment that you have made to Africa. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We look forward to doing another one of these before too long.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bobi.
Thank you. Ebigambo byakyagu sentamu ati Bobi Wine ng'agezaako okutuusa ensonga enkulu eri bamusiganso eri abagabi b'obuyambi nga bagamba ebyo ensimbi nnyingi ze bawa abakulembeze ba Africa naye ate ensimbi abakulembeze abo ne bazikozesa bubi, ne bazikozesa mu byabwe, ne bazikozesa abantu bo ne beeyambanga bo mu bibataasa oba mu bibawonya abakulembeze ba Africa. N'olwekyo ng'ayagala ensimbi zino zireme kuddamu kuleetebwa mu Africa kuba ze zimu ku nsimbi ezitadde Africa emabega. Nti abakulembeze baalemwa bakozesa batya ensimbi zo wabula bongera ku mabanja ate ensimbi kyezikoze tewali ayinza kugamba nti zikoze kino. N'olwekyo ensimbi ez'obaayo IMF, banka y'ensi yonna, musota gwennyini ensimbi ezisaana ne ziyimizirizibwa kyokka na Africa ne bafuna abakulembeze abalungi, abakulembeze abafa ku bantu baabwe, abakulembeze abalowooza ku bana y'amawanga gaabwe ba yeggwanga lya Africa naye saaba beerowoozaako ne famire zaabwe. Kyagulanyi agamba nti ensimbi zino ze zitaddewo nti bannakyemalira mu Africa tebabanga balina ensimbi bazikozesa bo okwongera okwenywereza mu ntebe, bazikozesa okwongera okunywera okuzifuuka supergulu nga tebava ku ntebe ne bafuuka basita ntebe olw'ensimbi kubanga balina. Ensimbi ezo bazikozesa okukola ebintu eby'enjawulo omuli okugulirira, omuli okukola buli kyaba yeetaaze kuba ensimbi ziba weeziri oba tolina ky'omugamba, omugagga tagambwako. Kati nno ebigambo ebiriwo nti Kyagulanyi buli lwatambula, buli lwafuluma eggwanga Uganda, abaafuba kimu kulaba nti abazungu bano abawa Museveni ensimbi oba baateeka ensimbi mu Africa ate balekeraawo nti ayagala abakulembeze ba Africa abagambibwa okuba nti bannakyemalira oba bannakyemalira abali mu ntebe nga bakozesa maanyi, bakozesa mmundu okutuulamu, ayagala Kyagulanyi abazungu balekeraawo okukolagana nabo. Yeewuunya nti lwaki ovaayo n'ogamba gwe kennyini nti oyo teyalondeddwa oba akalulu tekabadde ka mazima na bwenkanya, ate omuntu alayidde n'otandika okukolagana naye kyokka nga gwe yagambye nti akalulu akamuleese mu ntebe tekabadde ka mazima na bwenkanya, nti balina okugyawo double standards zino. Ebintu ebimu bye bakola bibalabisa, tebasobola kwetengerera kuyimirirawo ku nsonga enkulu wabula bafa ku byabwe ku bibagasa ebyabwe bye bafaako ebiyamba Abafrika byo tebibakwatako kasitaba nga bo balina kye bafuna kye beetaaga bakifuna okuva mu Africa, ebisigale tebibakwatako. Naye ate nga bamu abagamba mbu ensi zaabwe ziri democratic naye ate nga tebaagala kukolagana na Africa eri democratic, baagala kukolagana na Africa etali democratic. Otyo bigambo bya Kyagulanyi ndowooza mbyogedde bulungi, sibikubyemu mbogo kyensuubira binnyonnyodde bulungi. Okay, kati nno mbeebaza nnyo mwenna abali mwebale kubaako, mwebale kutwagala, mwebale kutugoberera. Akadde akasiima era nja kasiima olubeerera ne kaddata ke muteekakaako, mwebale nnyo, mwebale ddala. Omukama Katonda yaba bampeera empeera kuba nze sirina kyakubawa okuggyako bayitira amawulire, naye ebirungi bye mwetaaga nsaba Omukama Katonda Lugaba Namugereka oyo Ddunda Nantalemwa Kabamba ggulu abibampeere, buli kye mwetaaga akibampeere, mube basanyufu, muba basanyufu mujja mulaba amawulire ebifa mu ggwanga lyammwe Uganda, ate tutambule tugende mu maaso. Nange nno bwentyo bwe nkubidde, mweraba.